fallen into darkness, forgotten by history. The untold suffering of Rome's female prisoners. Beneath the Colosseum's arches, thousands of women were trapped, not as fighters, not as criminals, but as living symbols of Rome's power. They were chained, humiliated, and forced to die in public spectacles. Their screams filled the arena, yet history erased their names. Today, no stone marks their suffering, but their story survives. What really happened to the women Rome wanted the world to forget? In the next hour, you will discover the dark reality hidden beneath one of history's greatest monuments. Before the Colosseum became a symbol of Rome's power, it was already a place built on fear. Long before crowds gathered and emperors waved from marble balconies, thousands of women had already lost everything. These women were not warriors seeking glory, nor criminals awaiting justice. They were captives of empire, taken from their homes, their families, and their identities, and dragged into a world that treated suffering as entertainment. Their stories were never meant to survive, because Rome did not want witnesses to its cruelty. Most female prisoners connected to the Colosseum came from conquered lands. When Roman legions marched into foreign territories, victory did not end with the battlefield. Villages were burned, leaders executed, and survivors collected like spoils. Women were especially vulnerable. Young girls, mothers, widows, and even elderly women were chained together and forced to march for weeks toward Roman cities. Many died on the road from exhaustion, hunger, or illness. Those who survived the journey arrived already broken, but their suffering was only beginning. Once inside Roman territory, these women were processed not as humans, but as property. Officials decided their fate based on usefulness. Some were sent directly to slave markets. Others, especially those from rebellious regions or royal families, were marked for public punishment. The Colosseum was not just a sports arena. It was a political weapon. Displaying the suffering of conquered women sent a clear message to the empire. Resistance leads to humiliation and death. The female prisoners destined for the Colosseum were taken to underground holding areas near the arena. These spaces were cold, damp, and deliberately hidden from public view. Roman citizens celebrated the games above, unaware or unwilling to care that beneath their feet women sat in darkness, chained and terrified. These underground chambers were designed to strip prisoners of dignity. There was no privacy, no comfort, and no certainty of survival. Many women did not even know where they were. They had never heard of Rome, let alone the Colosseum. They did not understand the language shouted by guards. They learned through pain. Whips were used not only for punishment, but for communication. Hunger became routine. Water was rationed. Disease spread quickly, and the weak were left to die without ceremony. Their bodies were removed quietly, as if they had never existed. What made the suffering even more severe was the psychological torture. Roman officials rarely explained a prisoner's fate. Women were left in constant uncertainty. One day, a fellow prisoner would be dragged away screaming. Another day, someone would vanish silently in the night. This unpredictability was intentional. Fear was easier to control than resistance. When people do not know what awaits them, they stop fighting and start obeying. Female prisoners were treated differently from male captives, but not more kindly. While some male prisoners were trained as gladiators and given minimal medical care to preserve their fighting ability, women were rarely considered worth such investment. Most were viewed as disposable. Their bodies were used to create spectacles of humiliation rather than contests of strength. Rome wanted to show dominance, not fairness. Some women were forced into labor connected to the games. They cleaned blood from the arena floor after executions. They carried equipment. They tended animals under threat of violence. Performing these tasks meant witnessing death daily. The smell of blood, sweat, and decay became normal. Over time, many women stopped reacting emotionally. This numbness was not strength, it was survival. The worst suffering came at night. In the darkness of the underground chambers, memories returned. Women remembered children left behind, husbands killed, homes burned. Many whispered prayers to gods Rome did not recognize. Others cried silently, fearing punishment if guards heard them. Some lost their sanity entirely, rocking back and forth, repeating names no one answered. Roman society did not consider this cruelty immoral. To the empire, these women represented chaos that had been conquered. Their pain was justified by the idea of Roman order. Philosophers argued that suffering maintained balance. Politicians claimed it preserved peace. The crowd wanted distraction, and so the system continued, unquestioned. Occasionally, rumors spread among prisoners about the arena itself. Some women were told they would be executed publicly. Others believed they would be forced to perform roles in staged myths. These reenactments were especially cruel. Roman audiences enjoyed seeing myths brought to life, even when life meant real death. Women were dressed as mythological figures only to be killed according to the story. To the crowd, it was theater. To the prisoner, it was unavoidable execution. For many women, the first time they saw the Colosseum was the last thing they ever saw. Emerging from darkness into blinding sunlight, they were overwhelmed by noise. Tens of thousands of people watched them, judged them, and decided their worth in seconds. Fear, confusion, and despair collided in those moments. Some collapsed before reaching the center of the arena. Guards dragged them forward anyway. The crowd rarely saw them as individuals. A woman in the arena was not a person with a past. She was a symbol of Rome's power. Mercy was uncommon, and when it occurred, it was usually granted for entertainment, not compassion. Death was faster than survival. Survival meant continued suffering. Yet even in this darkness, acts of quiet resistance existed. Some women refused to scream. Others stood tall in their final moments, denying the crowd the pleasure of visible fear. These moments were small, but they mattered. They were the last expressions of identity in a system designed to erase it. History did not record their names. Roman writers focused on emperors, gladiators, and victories. Female prisoners were footnotes at best, invisible at worst. But their suffering was real, and it shaped the empire as much as any battle or law. The Colosseum stands today as a marvel of engineering. Tourists take photographs, admire its scale, and celebrate its endurance. But beneath the stone lies a truth that cannot be ignored. This monument was built not only with skill and ambition, but with fear, blood, and the silent suffering of women whose voices were never meant to be heard. Session 1 ends here, not with closure, but with understanding. Because to understand the Colosseum, one must first understand the darkness beneath it. For the female prisoners held beneath the Colosseum, time did not move forward in any normal sense. Days were not measured by sunlight or routine, but by hunger, fear, and the sounds from above. The roar of the crowd was often the only indication that another day had passed. The women could not see the arena, but they felt it. Every cheer reminded them that suffering was celebrated just a few meters above their heads. Life underground was designed to break the human spirit slowly, efficiently, and without witnesses. The underground structures beneath the Colosseum were not accidental or temporary. They were carefully engineered spaces known today as the hypogeum. Corridors, lifts, cages, and holding cells formed a complex system meant to move people and animals like objects. For female prisoners, this system became a prison without mercy. The air was heavy with moisture and decay. Light was scarce, often limited to torches carried by guards. Darkness was not only physical but psychological, as prisoners lost all sense of time, direction, and control over their lives. Women were held in groups or alone depending on their intended fate. Those marked for public execution or spectacle were often isolated to prevent resistance or suicide. Others were kept together to reduce the need for guards, as fear itself became a form of control. Chains were common, not always because escape was likely, but because restraint reminded prisoners of their status. Even when chains were removed, the sense of captivity remained deeply ingrained. Food was minimal and deliberately insufficient. Prisoners were fed only enough to keep them alive until their scheduled use. Meals consisted of coarse bread, watery porridge, or leftovers unsuitable for Roman citizens. Hunger was constant, Over time, it changed how the women thought, spoke, and moved. Conversations became shorter. Energy was conserved. Even grief was muted by exhaustion. Hunger was one of Rome's most effective weapons because it weakened both body and will. Water, though available, was often dirty and shared among many prisoners. Illness spread rapidly. Fevers, infections, and untreated wounds were common. Medical care was rare and reserved only for individuals considered valuable to the games. Female prisoners were usually not among them. A woman who became too sick to walk was often removed quietly and never seen again. Death underground did not require an audience. Guards enforced discipline through unpredictability. Punishments were not consistent or fair. Sometimes a woman would be beaten for speaking too loudly. Other times, silence itself was punished. This randomness created constant anxiety. The prisoners learned that logic offered no protection. Compliance did not guarantee safety. Resistance guaranteed pain. Over time, many women stopped trying to understand the rules, because there were none that offered survival with dignity. Psychological torture was constant and deliberate. Guards spread rumors about upcoming executions. They exaggerated the cruelty of the arena. They described deaths in graphic detail, not to inform, but to terrify. For women who had never seen the Colosseum, these stories created vivid nightmares long before reality arrived. Fear became internalized. Even when guards were absent, the terror remained. Sleep offered little escape. Underground chambers echoed with sounds. Chains scraping stone, distant screams, animals roaring in cages. Nightmares were common. Many women woke in panic, unsure where they were or why they were there. Some called out names of family members who would never answer. Others learned to suppress memory entirely, retreating into emotional numbness as a defense mechanism. The loss of identity was one of the most damaging aspects of captivity. Names were rarely used. Women were identified by origin, appearance, or function. A woman might be referred to only as the one from the north or the prisoner for tomorrow. This dehumanization was intentional. By stripping prisoners of identity, Rome made it easier to justify their suffering. A nameless person is easier to destroy. Despite this, small communities formed among the prisoners. Women shared information quietly, who had been taken, who had died, which guards were crueler than others. These exchanges were dangerous but necessary. Knowledge offered a small sense of control in a world designed to remove it. In some cases, older women comforted younger ones, teaching them how to endure hunger or avoid punishment. These acts of care were forms of resistance, even if Rome never recognized them as such. Religion and belief played a crucial role in survival. Many women prayed to gods Rome had labeled false or barbaric. These prayers were whispered, sometimes only thought, never spoken aloud. Faith did not guarantee survival, but it offered meaning in a system that thrived on meaninglessness. Some women believed death in the arena would reunite them with loved ones. Others believed endurance itself was sacred. Rome could control bodies, but belief was harder to conquer. Sexual violence was an unspoken reality of captivity. While not officially part of the games, abuse by guards and officials occurred in spaces hidden from record. Victims had no recourse, no protection, and no voice. This violence was not considered a crime against prisoners. It was seen as a privilege of power. The shame and trauma carried by these women remained invisible to history, but it deeply shaped their experience of captivity. Women who survived long periods underground often changed physically. Weight loss was severe. Hair fell out or was shaved. Posture changed as bodies adapted to cramped spaces. Eyes became hollow. Movements slowed. These changes were not accidental. Rome understood that a broken appearance reinforced dominance. When a woman finally emerged into the arena, her weakened state amplified the spectacle of her defeat. The sounds from above played a unique psychological role. Cheers, applause, and music signaled celebrations of death. Prisoners learned to associate joy with suffering. When the crowd roared loudly, it often meant someone had died dramatically. Silence sometimes meant prolonged cruelty. Over time, women developed a painful awareness of the rhythms of violence. The Colosseum became a living entity, breathing fear into the underground. Some prisoners attempted to resist internally by refusing to show fear when taken. They walked slowly, held their heads high, or remained silent. These actions did not change their fate, but they preserved dignity. Guards sometimes punished such behavior, interpreting it as defiance. Still, many women chose dignity over compliance, even when it meant harsher treatment. The Roman public never saw this underground reality. Citizens attended games believing they were witnessing justice, tradition, or entertainment. They did not see the weeks or months of suffering that preceded each death. This separation was deliberate. Rome needed the arena to appear glorious, not cruel. The suffering of women beneath it had to remain invisible for the system to continue unquestioned. Occasionally, a woman would be removed from the underground not for execution, but for sale or reassignment. Survival in these cases was not a victory. It meant transfer to another form of captivity, slavery, forced labor, or exploitation. The Colosseum was not the end of suffering, only one chapter in a longer story of control. For those who remained underground, hope became dangerous. Hope made waiting unbearable. Many women learned to abandon the future entirely and exist only in the present moment. Survival became mechanical: eat when food appears, sleep when exhaustion forces it, move when ordered. This emotional withdrawal was a form of protection. Feeling less meant suffering less. By the time a woman was finally brought into the arena, much of her humanity had already been stripped away. The spectacle above was only the final act. The real cruelty had occurred below, unseen, unrecorded, and unacknowledged. The Colosseum did not simply kill people. It prepared them for death through prolonged degradation. Session 2 reveals a truth often ignored by history. The arena was only the surface. The true horror existed beneath it, where women endured a slow destruction of body, mind, and identity long before the crowd ever saw them. For female prisoners, the moment of entering the Colosseum marked the final transformation from captive to symbol. Everything that happened underground was preparation. The arena itself was not a place of justice, nor even primarily a place of combat. It was a stage upon which Roman power performed itself. When a woman was brought into the arena, her body was no longer her own. It became a message, crafted carefully by the state and delivered to tens of thousands of spectators in stone seats rising toward the sky. Women were not brought into the arena for the same reasons as men. Male prisoners, particularly gladiators, were framed as fighters whose deaths carried a twisted sense of honor. Female prisoners were framed as warnings. Their presence communicated conquest, domination, and moral superiority. Rome did not need them to fight well. It needed them to submit visibly, publicly, and irreversibly. Most female prisoners entered the arena during the midday spectacles, a period Romans considered less prestigious than gladiatorial combat. This timing was deliberate. Midday executions were associated with punishment, not heroism. The crowd often treated this portion of the games casually, eating, talking, and moving about. For the women brought into the arena at this time, indifference was as powerful a form of cruelty as violence. To die without even the dignity of attention was the ultimate statement of worthlessness imposed by the empire. When a woman emerged into the arena, she was often disoriented. The sudden transition from darkness to blinding sunlight overwhelmed the senses. The roar of the crowd was unlike anything she had ever heard. Thousands of voices merged into a single, uncontrollable force. This sound alone was enough to break many prisoners before any punishment occurred. Rome understood this psychological effect well. The scale of the Colosseum was not accidental. It was designed to crush the individual beneath the collective. Women were often stripped of personal clothing and dressed in costumes chosen by Roman officials. These costumes were not meant to protect or dignify them. They were meant to erase identity and impose meaning. In many cases, women were forced to portray figures from Roman mythology. These reenactments were presented as cultural performances, but in reality they were executions disguised as art. The audience watched familiar stories unfold, rarely acknowledging that the person dying was not a character, but a real human being. In these myth-based executions, the outcome was predetermined. A woman portraying a mythological figure doomed to die would be killed in the manner dictated by the story. To the Roman mind, this transformed execution into entertainment. Death became narrative, and narrative made cruelty acceptable. The woman's fear, pain, and resistance were absorbed into the myth and therefore dismissed as necessary. Some women were forced to face animals in the arena. This practice was not about testing strength or skill. It was about vulnerability. An untrained, weakened prisoner stood little chance against even a moderately aggressive animal. The crowd did not expect survival. What they watched was the imbalance of power made visible. Rome demonstrated that it could control nature, humanity, and death itself within the same space. Public humiliation was a central element of these spectacles. Women were often displayed in ways meant to provoke mockery rather than sympathy. Roman society associated female captivity with moral judgment. A woman from a conquered land was portrayed as inherently inferior, her suffering justified by her status as an outsider. This framing allowed the audience to detach emotionally. If the victim was already considered lesser, her pain did not demand compassion. Execution methods varied depending on the message Rome wanted to send. Some deaths were swift, others deliberately prolonged. Speed was reserved for efficiency, not mercy. Prolongation was used when the crowd demanded spectacle. The woman's endurance, or lack of it, became part of the entertainment. Her reactions were scrutinized, judged, and consumed. Rome turned the private experience of dying into a public commodity. It is important to understand that these executions were not chaotic. They were carefully planned events integrated into the broader structure of the games. Officials decided which prisoners would be executed, how, and when. The arena functioned as an extension of the legal and political system. Death was not random violence. It was regulated, ritualized, and normalized. The crowd's role was essential. Spectators were not passive observers. Their reactions influenced the course of events. Applause, silence, or disapproval could shape how an execution unfolded. This dynamic created a shared responsibility for suffering. Rome did not kill alone. It killed with approval. The audience became part of the machinery of punishment. For female prisoners, this awareness intensified the trauma. To be watched while dying, to feel judgment in thousands of eyes, stripped away any remaining sense of privacy or humanity. Many women understood that the crowd did not see them as individuals. They do seen as representatives of defeated peoples, as warnings, as objects. This realization often caused despair deeper than fear itself. Some women resisted in subtle ways. They refused to beg. They stood still when expected to flee. They met death with silence rather than screams. These acts did not change the outcome, but they disrupted the narrative Rome tried to impose. A calm, dignified death challenged the idea that the victim was inferior or deserving of humiliation. Such moments unsettled audiences, even if briefly. Roman writers rarely recorded these reactions. Official histories focused on emperors, architecture, and political achievements. The emotional complexity of executions was inconvenient, contradicted the image of Rome as rational and just. As a result, the inner lives of female prisoners were erased from the historical record, leaving only fragments reconstructed through archaeology, legal texts, and indirect accounts. Women who were not executed immediately sometimes remained in the arena as part of extended spectacles. They might be forced to witness other deaths before their own. This was not accidental cruelty. It reinforced power by demonstrating that Rome controlled not only life and death, but also the sequence and meaning of suffering. Waiting to die while watching others perish was a form of psychological domination. Occasionally, a woman survived an arena appearance, either through chance or audience intervention. Such survival did not indicate mercy. It simply delayed suffering. Survivors were often returned to captivity, sold, or reassigned. The arena did not offer redemption. It offered exposure. Once a woman had been seen by the crowd, her fate was sealed within the system. The Roman public often justified these spectacles through ideology. Executions were framed as justice. Myth reenactments were framed as culture. Animal confrontations were framed as bravery tests. These narratives allowed ordinary citizens to enjoy violence without confronting its reality. The suffering of women was filtered through layers of meaning that protected the audience from guilt. Children were present in the crowd. Families attended the games together. This normalized violence across generations. Watching a woman die became a shared cultural experience, not a moral crisis. The Colosseum taught Roman citizens what lives were valued and which were expendable. Female prisoners consistently fell into the latter category. From a modern perspective, it is difficult to comprehend how such cruelty could be accepted so casually. But within the Roman worldview, the empire's stability justified extreme measures. Order mattered more than individual life. Spectacle reinforced unity. Fear maintained control. The suffering of women was collateral damage in a system that prioritized dominance over empathy. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The design of the Colosseum facilitated rapid movement of prisoners, animals, and bodies. Trapdoors, lifts, and hidden corridors allowed executions to occur efficiently and repeatedly. This efficiency reveals intent. Rome did not stumble into cruelty. It engineered it. Female prisoners were particularly effective symbols because their suffering challenged traditional notions of protection and vulnerability. By publicly punishing women, Rome demonstrated that no one was beyond its reach. Even those typically associated with domestic or private spaces could be exposed, judged, and destroyed. This message resonated deeply across the empire. Despite Rome's efforts to control the narrative, discomfort sometimes surfaced. Philosophers debated the moral impact of the games. Some spectators reportedly turned away during particularly brutal executions. These moments of doubt, however, rarely led to change. The system was too deeply embedded in Roman identity to be dismantled by individual discomfort. For the women themselves, the arena represented the final stage of dehumanization. Everything that made them who they were, language, family, memory, had already been stripped away. What remained was a body subjected to public judgment. Death, in this context, was not merely the end of life. It was the completion of Rome's message. The Colosseum still stands today, admired as a masterpiece of engineering. Visitors walk its corridors, take photographs, and imagine the excitement of ancient games. But few consider the women who stood in that space not as spectators, but as condemned. Their stories were never carved into stone. Their names were never celebrated. Yet their suffering is as much a part of the Colosseum as its arches and walls. Session 3 forces a confrontation with this reality. The arena was not only a place where people died. It was a place where meaning was imposed through violence, where female prisoners were transformed into tools of empire. Their deaths were not accidents of history. They were deliberate acts within a system that valued power over humanity. Understanding this truth does not diminish Rome's achievements. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that greatness built on suffering carries a cost that history cannot ignore forever. The women who entered the Colosseum did not choose to become symbols, but their experiences now symbolize a truth Rome tried to hide. Session 3 ends not with resolution, but with recognition. Because to recognize these women is to challenge the narratives that erased them. And once recognized, they cannot be forgotten again. Survival in the Roman Colosseum did not mean escape from suffering. For female prisoners who lived beyond their appearance in the arena, survival often marked the beginning of a different, quieter form of captivity. The public spectacle had ended, but the system that produced it continued to control their bodies, their labor, and their futures. Rome rarely released what it had claimed. A woman who survived the arena did not regain her identity. She simply entered another layer of invisibility. Many surviving women were removed from the Colosseum not because of mercy, but because they were deemed useful elsewhere. Some were sold into private slavery. Others were transferred to state-controlled labor or forced into service within Roman households. The transition from public punishment to private exploitation was seamless. In Roman society, survival did not imply value as a human being. It implied value as property. For these women, the psychological impact of the arena never faded. The memory of standing before thousands of spectators, stripped of control and dignity, reshaped how they perceived the world. Even in quieter environments, they lived with constant fear. Sudden noises, raised voices, or crowds triggered memories of the Colosseum. Trauma was not recognized as an injury in Roman culture. There was no language for it, no treatment, no acknowledgement. Women were expected to continue functioning as if nothing had happened. Silence became a survival strategy. Speaking about the arena was dangerous. It reminded owners, guards, or officials of a woman's past, which could provoke cruelty or punishment. Silence also protected Roman society from confronting its own violence. The empire relied on forgetting. Survivors learned quickly that remembering aloud carried consequences. Many never spoke of the arena again, even decades later. Physical scars remained, though they were often hidden beneath clothing or labor. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, and illness weakened bodies permanently. Some women developed chronic pain or mobility issues. Others suffered reproductive harm due to prolonged deprivation and abuse. These conditions limited their ability to work, which in turn affected how they were treated. In a system that valued productivity above humanity, weakness invited neglect. Women sold into private households experienced a different form of control. Unlike the public brutality of the arena, domestic slavery relied on constant surveillance and obedience. The trauma of past humiliation made resistance difficult. Many women complied automatically, having learned that disobedience led to pain. The psychological conditioning imposed by the Colosseum followed them into every aspect of daily life. In elite Roman households, some women were kept as servants with specific roles. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, or assisted mistresses. Their proximity to Roman family life did not grant protection. Abuse remained common and largely unchallenged. A woman's past as a prisoner of the arena often marked her as especially vulnerable, because it signaled that she had already been publicly dehumanized. Other survivors were sent to state-run labor facilities or rural estates. These environments were less visible than the arena but equally unforgiving. Long hours, poor living conditions, and strict discipline defined daily existence. The difference was that suffering occurred out of sight, beyond the awareness of the Roman public. This invisibility was not accidental. Rome preferred its cruelty hidden once its message had been delivered. Some women were forced into prostitution, either directly controlled by the state or by private owners. This fate was rarely recorded, but evidence suggests it was widespread. In these circumstances, a woman's body continued to serve Roman interests, stripped of autonomy and safety. Trauma compounded over time. The arena had taken dignity. Exploitation took hope. Motherhood, when it occurred, was complicated by captivity. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status. For some women, children became a reason to endure. For others, motherhood intensified fear, knowing their child would grow up within the same system of control. Roman law did not prioritize the emotional bonds between enslaved mothers and children. Separation was common and unchallenged. Memory played a complex role in survival. Some women tried to forget their lives before captivity, believing memory only deepened pain. Others clung to memories as proof that they had once been more than property. Both approaches carried emotional cost. Forgetting meant losing identity. Remembering meant reliving loss. There was no safe way to carry the past. Religion sometimes offered a fragile form of comfort. Women continued to pray to ancestral gods or adopt Roman beliefs if it provided protection or stability. Faith did not restore freedom, but it helped some make sense of suffering. In a society that justified cruelty through power, belief allowed individuals to imagine a moral order beyond Rome's authority. Roman society did not consider survivors of the arena as witnesses. Their experiences were not valued as testimony. There were no public records of what they endured, no official acknowledgement of harm. Even when philosophers criticized the games, they focused on moral decay among spectators, not on the lived experiences of victims. Women remained background figures, their pain absorbed into abstract debate. Aging presented new challenges. As women grew older and less physically capable, their usefulness diminished. Some were sold again. Others were abandoned or left to die quietly. Old age offered no respect or security. Survival through youth did not guarantee survival through time. Rome consumed bodies until nothing remained. Yet even within this system, traces of agency persisted. Some women formed quiet bonds with others in captivity. Shared labor created small communities of understanding. These connections were fragile and often temporary, but they offered moments of recognition. To be seen by another person, even briefly, countered the total erasure imposed by slavery. Occasionally, a woman gained limited autonomy through long service, negotiation, or circumstance. Such cases were rare and often overstated in Roman literature to present slavery as humane. Even when a woman achieved relative stability, the memory of the arena remained. Freedom, when it existed, was incomplete and fragile. The Roman public rarely encountered these survivors. Once a woman disappeared from the arena, she disappeared from cultural attention. This separation allowed citizens to enjoy the games without confronting long-term consequences. The suffering they witnessed was framed as momentary, contained within the spectacle. The reality was ongoing and dispersed throughout Roman society. From a historical perspective, this silence is significant. The absence of survivor narratives does not indicate absence of survivors. It indicates a system that did not preserve their voices. Modern historians reconstruct these lives indirectly through legal documents, household records, and archaeological findings. Each fragment suggests continuity of suffering beyond the arena. The Colosseum's role did not end with death. It shaped lives long after the crowd dispersed. For women who survived, the arena became a defining rupture, dividing life into before and after. The after was marked by caution, compliance, and grief carried quietly. Rome succeeded not only in punishing bodies, but in reshaping inner worlds. This long-term impact reveals the true function of the games. They were not isolated events, but part of a broader system of control that extended into private spaces. Public violence trained survivors to accept private domination. The arena conditioned behavior long after the spectacle ended. Modern admiration for Roman civilization often overlooks this continuity. Architecture, law, and governance are celebrated, while the human cost is minimized. Female survivors of the Colosseum challenge this selective memory. Their lives demonstrate that Roman order was maintained through sustained, normalized cruelty. Session 4 exposes a truth often hidden beneath narratives of survival. Living through the arena did not restore dignity or agency. It prolonged captivity in less visible forms. Survival was not triumph. It was endurance within a system designed to extract value until nothing remained. These women did not leave monuments behind. They did not write histories. Their resistance was quiet and internal, expressed through endurance rather than rebellion. Remembering them requires acknowledging that survival itself can be a form of suffering. Session 4 ends with this recognition. The Colosseum did not end at its walls. Its influence followed women into homes, fields, and shadows, shaping lives long after the crowd stopped watching. To understand the true cost of the games, one must look beyond death and into the long, silent years that followed. The Roman Colosseum survives as one of the most recognizable structures in human history. Its arches stand firm against time, weather, and war, admired as symbols of engineering brilliance and imperial ambition. Yet the endurance of stone has long overshadowed the fragility of the lives consumed within it. For female prisoners whose suffering unfolded in silence, the Colosseum did not represent glory or achievement. It represented erasure. Session 5 confronts the final and perhaps most enduring cruelty inflicted upon these women: the removal of their stories from history itself. Ancient Rome controlled not only territory and people but memory. History was written by elite men who benefited from imperial power. Their records focused on emperors, victories, architecture, and law. Women, especially enslaved or foreign women, rarely appeared except as symbols or background figures. Those who suffered in the Colosseum were excluded almost entirely. This absence was not accidental. It reflected a deliberate choice about whose lives were considered worthy of remembrance. Female prisoners did not leave behind written testimonies. Literacy was rare among the enslaved, and even literate women had no means to preserve their experiences. Their voices were silenced by force and circumstance. As a result, modern understanding relies on indirect evidence. Legal texts, inscriptions, architectural remains, and scattered references in literature that never intended to center their suffering. The challenge for historians is not the lack of truth, but the lack of permission those women were ever given to speak. Roman ideology played a central role in this erasure. The empire defined itself through order, hierarchy, and dominance. Acknowledging the suffering of female prisoners would have undermined the moral narrative Rome constructed about itself. Violence was framed as justice. Spectacle was framed as culture. The victim's humanity disrupted this framing, so it was ignored, became policy. Over time, this silence hardened into tradition. Later generations inherited a version of Roman history that celebrated its monuments while overlooking their human cost. The Colosseum became a symbol detached from the lives it destroyed. Tourists admired scale and symmetry without confronting purpose. This separation between structure and suffering is one of the most powerful legacies of empire. The ability to turn violence into abstraction. Yet traces of truth survived. Archaeology revealed the complexity of the hypogeum beneath the arena, exposing the machinery that enabled mass spectacle. Scholars uncovered evidence of executions disguised as mythological reenactments. Legal records confirmed the status of prisoners as property, not persons. Each discovery chipped away at the sanitized image of the games. Slowly, the women erased by history began to reappear, not as names but as realities. Modern historical scholarship has shifted focus from emperors to everyday lives, from triumphs to trauma. Within this shift, the experiences of female prisoners have gained renewed attention. Researchers now recognize that understanding Rome requires confronting its systems of violence, not merely its achievements. The Colosseum is no longer viewed solely as entertainment architecture, but as an institution of control. This reevaluation forces uncomfortable questions. How could a society capable of advanced engineering also normalize extreme cruelty? How did ordinary citizens justify watching women suffer and die? These questions do not have simple answers. Roman culture did not view empathy as universal. Moral concern was often limited to citizens and social equals. Outsiders existed beyond the circle of protection. Female prisoners fell far outside that circle. Gender intensified vulnerability. Roman society valued women primarily for their roles within the household. Foreign or enslaved women existed outside these roles and therefore outside social concern. Their suffering did not challenge Roman identity. It reinforced it. Public punishment of women demonstrated that Rome's power extended into all spaces, including those traditionally associated with privacy or protection. The long-term impact of this worldview extends beyond ancient history. The mechanisms that allowed Roman spectators to detach from suffering, dehumanization, narrative framing, distance are not unique to Rome. They reappear throughout history wherever violence is justified through ideology. Studying the Colosseum's female prisoners is not only an act of historical recovery. It is a warning. Memory plays a critical role in justice. When suffering is forgotten, systems that produced it remain unchallenged. The women of the Colosseum were denied memory during their lives and long after their deaths. Restoring their presence in historical understanding does not undo what was done to them, but it disrupts the silence that enabled it. Modern audiences often ask whether remembering such suffering serves any purpose. The answer lies in recognition. Recognition affirms that these women existed as individuals, not merely as instruments of spectacle. It acknowledges that their pain was real and undeserved. It challenges narratives that glorify power without accountability. Education plays a central role in this process. When the Colosseum is taught as a site of entertainment alone, it perpetuates a partial truth. When it is presented as a site of systemic violence, it invites deeper reflection. Female prisoners become central to this reflection because their stories reveal how power operates at its most intimate level, through control of bodies, identity, and memory. Art, literature, and media have begun to engage with this darker understanding of Roman history. Documentaries, academic works, and responsible storytelling now include perspectives once excluded. These efforts are not about condemning the past by modern standards alone, but about understanding the full complexity of human societies. Progress begins with honesty. The absence of names remains one of the most haunting aspects of this history. We do not know who these women were individually. We do not know their languages, their families, or their dreams. This anonymity is itself a form of violence that continues into the present. Yet anonymity does not negate existence. Millions lived and suffered without being recorded. Acknowledging this challenges the idea that history equals importance. The Colosseum's preservation contrasts sharply with the disposability of human life within it. Stone was protected. People were consumed. This imbalance invites reflection on modern priorities. What do societies choose to preserve, and what do they allow to disappear? Whose stories are considered valuable? These questions extend far beyond ancient Rome. For descendants of conquered peoples, the Colosseum can represent inherited trauma. It symbolizes not only Roman dominance, but the suffering of ancestors whose voices were silenced. Recognizing female prisoners within this narrative expands understanding of imperial impact beyond military defeat to lived human experience. Silence around women's suffering is not unique to Rome. Throughout history, women's experiences have often been marginalized, especially when they complicate dominant narratives. Recovering the stories of the Colosseum's female prisoners contributes to a broader effort to center women within historical analysis, not as exceptions, but as integral participants and victims. The ethical responsibility of modern storytelling lies in balance. It is possible to acknowledge Roman achievements while refusing to excuse cruelty. Complexity does not require neutrality toward suffering. Understanding how systems operate allows societies to question whether similar dynamics persist today. Session 5 does not offer closure because history rarely does. The women of the Colosseum did not receive justice in their time. They did not receive memorials or apologies. What they receive now is recognition. Recognition is not compensation, but it is a beginning. By remembering these women, modern audiences confront the cost of spectacle and the dangers of dehumanization. The Colosseum becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a lesson about how easily societies can normalize cruelty when it is ritualized, justified, and hidden behind tradition. The true legacy of the Colosseum is not only architectural endurance. It is the reminder that power without empathy produces suffering that echoes across centuries. The women who lived and died under its shadow were denied the chance to define their own lives. History denied them space. Remembering them restores a measure of dignity stolen long ago. Session 5 ends with this understanding. History is not complete until it includes those who were silenced. The Colosseum still stands, but it no longer stands alone. It stands alongside the memory of women whose lives it consumed, women who matter not because they were exceptional, but because they were human. And as long as their stories are told, the silence Rome imposed is broken.